Díagh go léir cóide agus tá fáilte ród. Welcome to my story with me, Mary Honan. And my guest today is Agnes Grunwald Spier, MBE. Agnes was born in Budapest in July 1944. Her mother, with Agnes, a baby in her arms, was saved from deportation by an unknown Nazi official. Later, they were sent to the Budapest ghetto in November 1944 and were liberated in January 1945. A former civil servant, she holds degrees in history, politics, and Holocaust studies, and has been a member of Mensa since 1982. Agnes was a founder trustee of the Holocaust Memorial Trust, a member of, Díagh go léir cóide agus tá fáilte ród. Welcome to my story with me, Mary Honan. And today's guest is Agnes Grunwald Spier, MBE, who was born in Budapest in July 1944. Her mother, with Agnes, a baby in her arms, was saved from deportation by an unknown Nazi official. Later, they were sent to the Budapest ghetto in November 1944 and were liberated in January 1945. A former civil servant, she holds degrees in history, politics, and Holocaust studies, and has been a member of Mensa since 1982. Agnes was a founder trustee of the Holocaust Memorial Day Trust, a member of the Board of Deputies of British Jews for 15 years, and a member of the Architects Registration Board. She was a Justice of the Peace for 30 years and now lives in London. And she has written 3 books on the Holocaust. It is my great delight to welcome Agnes Grunwald Spier, MBE, to my show. Hello, Agnes. Hello, Agnes. How are you?
Mary, I'm very well. How are you?
I'm grand. You know, we had difficulties getting signals. God, this weather is shocking. You know, for anyone who doesn't know, it was just a nightmare trying to get to hear Agnes's lovely voice. But suddenly all is well with the world, and I can hear you. How are you, Agnes?
Oh, I'm fine. I think this awful wind and so on, I think it affects the signals.
Yes.
So let's hope I don't lose the Wi-Fi again.
No, I'm sure it'll be fine now. It'll be all downhill from here. Agnes, tell me about your story. You were born in Budapest, as I said in the introduction.
Yes, I was born in Budapest, as you rightly said. And you got it right as well, because a lot of people say I was born in the Budapest ghetto, which is incorrect and really annoys me. I'm used to doing this as a presentation, you know, with the photographs of my parents and so on. So basically, my parents were both Jewish and both Hungarian, and they were married in 1942. And although the war was waging around Europe then, Hungary was the last country to be occupied by the Germans, although the Hungarians themselves had introduced their own anti-Jewish laws very early on in the 30s. And if you read Hannah Senish's diaries, you'll see she talks about the first Jewish law and the second Jewish law. And Mother always said that the Hungarians were incredibly anti-Semitic, and that's why she called me Agnes, because she made up her mind that if she survived, she would leave Hungary. And although Agnes is a very popular name in Hungary, she was very well read and she knew it was an international name.
Yeah.
So all was reasonably well until sometime in 1943, my father was taken away as a forced labourer, which is what happened to a lot of Jewish men because they weren't allowed to be in the Hungarian army. And and that's important. It's important to remember it was 1943,
Yeah.
because again, that was before the Germans arrived. So this was something that the Hungarians organized themselves. And bizarrely, he was at one point allowed home on leave, which apparently was when I was conceived, which doesn't seem to have been a very sensible thing, really. But anyhow,
I think it was very sensible, Agnes. We wouldn't have got to know you if that hadn't happened.
That's true. I think the timing was poor. But he had a truly awful time. In fact, very few of the forced labourers returned after the war. My father did return. He was extremely embittered by his experiences, and he wouldn't have any more children after they were settled in England. My mother would have liked to have had more children because she was the eldest of four.
Were you an only child, Agnes?
I'm an only child. He said it wasn't a world to bring children into. Anyhow, in 1955, when I was 10, he committed suicide.
Oh,
so although he survived in some ways, in other ways he didn't really. And it's very sad because even now, I'm 77, but I'm still conscious of this void in my life as a result. He was very young. I mean, he was 45. So anyhow, that was my father's rather sad story. And I'm trying to write a family memoir as my fourth book. And I'm trying to find out what happened, how the forced labourers got back, because I can't imagine that there was sort of a row of nice shiny coaches waiting to take them home, and I don't suppose they were given any money or anything. And of course, I can't ask him. My mother was left in Budapest pregnant with me, and they had a flat which they didn't own. They rented like most people at that time. And in June 1944, when she was pretty heavily pregnant with me, she had to leave the flat and go to houses that were designated for Jewish women. It wasn't yet the ghetto. They were called Star of David houses. And from there, when I was on the way in mid-July, she had to go to a special clinic because she couldn't go to the ordinary maternity hospital because she was Jewish. And
they were insane times, weren't they? When you think about...
Well, they were, but I'm not sure that we're currently living in much better.
No, we're certainly not, Agnes. But, when you look at the Nuremberg laws and you think, the insanity of the laws and the insanity of,
But it was all legal, Mary.
It was, but this is what made it even more insane, is that it was all governmentally sanctioned. And the idea that even if you only had one grandmother who was Jewish, you were a Michelin second degree and subject to the same restrictions. Half-breed. Yeah, it's an awful phrase, but that's what it really means, Michelin second degree. And basically subject to the same restrictions or punishment as if you were fully Jewish. And it was just the laws were just so, and I suppose, you look at the likes of Whoopi Goldberg and her comment about Jews not being another race because they're not black and things like that. I presume you've heard about.
Oh yes, no. What she said was that the Holocaust wasn't about racism.
That's right.
But it just betrays such enormous ignorance. I mean, that's what I find quite exasperating now I'm involved in all this. That the fact that people haven't got a bloody clue what they're talking about doesn't stop them pontificating.
But I mean, we are all part of this this human race, as we say. But if it wasn't about race, what was it about? What were the Nuremberg race laws all about? If it wasn't about race, they defined Jews as being an inferior race, and that was the whole issue, which is what I couldn't understand. I just can't understand the lack of education that would actually bring about comments like that. Because yes, we it's just
But
it just
it's also coming from a blinkered perspective. I mean, because as far as Whoopi Goldberg is concerned, and why does she call herself Goldberg? It's not her birth name.
No, she said.
I mean, it's a Jewish surname.
It's a Jewish surname. She said that she had Jewish blood in her background. Her mother always said she'd never get on unless she actually took a Jewish name. So she changed her name from, I think it's Johnson, to Goldberg.
That's right. Yes. Anyhow, but on Twitter, I do quite a lot on Twitter. I find it's quite a good way of communicating.
I haven't got into it at all.
There's a lot of very ignorant people come out with the most amazing rubbish. And as I say, the fact that they haven't got a clue what they're talking about doesn't stop them. They just keep ploughing on. And in the end, I just say, I'm not going to waste any more time on you. There's no point. Because if they're not going to listen and they're not going to learn, there's no point. Anyhow, what I was going to go on to say was that, we did survive, my mother and I, and my father, obviously, and we came to England in May 1947, having spent a year in Vienna as displaced persons. And we came to England because my mother was the oldest of 4 girls, and the second one, Clara, had come to England before the war.
Oh, I love that name. I always said if I had a little girl ever, she was going to be Clara. I have no idea why, but I have, since I was a child, all I've ever wanted, if I was ever, was the love. I think I read a book before, Clara of the Red Shoes. She was a dancer, and I was obsessed with that name. It was my child was going to be called Clara.
But my youngest son got engaged over Christmas, and his fiancée is called Clara.
Wow.
So there you go. So anyhow, Clara signed the papers for us to come to England. And so we arrived in 1947. And obviously I've lived here ever since. And I ended up with 3 sons. But I was in my 50s when they were teenagers. Because they just didn't arrive any earlier. And I was concerned that if they asked me about the Holocaust, I didn't really feel very equipped to know anything about it because I kept it at a distance. Yeah. And so whilst I was thinking about that, it was when we were living in Sheffield, I heard that they were doing a master's in Holocaust studies. So I went off to do that. And it was great. I thoroughly enjoyed it. I learned a great deal, but I had to write a dissertation, as you'll probably know. And I decided to write about a man called Varian Fry, who was an American. You know him?
Well, I know of him.
Yes. So I wrote my dissertation about him, and that got me interested in rescuers. And why you would be a rescuer, because it was a very dangerous thing to do, not something to be embarked on lightly. And so I did a lot of research at the same sort of time as I divorced my husband. But my eldest was at university, but I still had 2 boys at home. So it took me a good 7 or 8 years to do the research, and eventually I ended up with all this information. And I thought, well, I've spent all that time. There's no point in it being stuck in a filing cabinet. I'll see if I can get it published. And I tried on my own, but I didn't get anywhere. But eventually, I met someone actually through the Architects Registration Board who was really nice, and he said he'd help me. And he actually did, because I'm so used to people saying, "Oh yes, I'll help you with that,"
Isn't
and
it
then they
terrible
disappear into the night.
Isn't it terrible when people do that? Because, I'm the type of person, if I say I'll do something, if it kills me,
Exactly.
I'll do it.
Yeah.
And I don't understand how people will say, "Oh, I'll do that for you. Leave that with me."
But anyhow, this chap did, and I was very lucky. I got a publisher in 2009, and so my first book, which is this one,
The other Schindler.
which is about the Holocaust rescuers.
It's
The people I wrote about were all people where I had personal contact
yeah,
with the rescuer or the rescued or their relatives,
yeah,
because what I was interested in was the motivation in being a rescuer. So,
yeah.
I mean,
First-hand testimony.
I think the Yad Vashem has recognized well over 24,000 righteous amongst the Gentiles. There were
Yeah,
an awful lot of people. Unfortunately, a lot of them have not been recognized.
yeah, yeah.
But so anyhow, this book was published in 2010 when I was 65. And so I was quite pleased with myself, and I sort of thought, well, that's that. But after a couple of years, I found that I really missed it. I knew I liked research because I'd done research previously when we lived in a village in Worcestershire. But what I hadn't realised until I wrote that book was how much I actually enjoyed writing, the actual process of writing, and so on. So after a couple of years or so, I decided to write. I thought, well, I'd written about the good guys, so I'll write about the other ones. So then I wrote about
Who betrayed the Jews?
yes, which is a big fat book, as you can see. Over 660 pages.
You were making up for lost time.
And well, there were just more people to write about. And I mean, it took me 4 years to write it. And it was very hard. I mean, the hardest bit to write was the chapter on the children. But I did it in topics. So there's a chapter on Jewish soldiers who fought for their native land in the First World War, and Jewish Olympians and sports people who competed for their country but were still caught up in the Holocaust. And betrayal by your friends, and betrayal by your neighbours, and betrayal by the government, and in education and so on. So although it's a big fat book, it's not written chronologically, it's written in topics and so on. And that's
makes it very easy to read.
Very easy to read. And people tell me that although it's a difficult subject, that my books are very readable. Obviously, I can't judge that. But
the fact that it isn't in chronological order, you can actually just open up a chapter and read it, and you can go back to a previous chapter.
Exactly.
And you're not missing out on anything, because
also to write about the Holocaust in chronological order, all those different countries and so on. I mean, it's virtually impossible.
Yeah.
The last one,
unless you're writing a piece of fiction based on the Holocaust, then you might you'd obviously go in chronological order if you're trying to tell a story in fictional form. But it's very difficult in a factual book to tell anything in chronological order, unless you're actually.
I don't believe in Holocaust fiction. So.
Don't you? That's interesting.
Because I write my books because I want people to know what really happened. I don't want them to read the watered down version of what happened. I want them to really know the truth. And therefore, with Holocaust fiction, you never really know what's true. And I mean, that book, which has been sold millions of copies all over the
Boy in the striped pajamas.
Well, no, not that one. The tattooist.
Tattooist of Auschwitz.
Yes, I mean the Auschwitz Museum won't have anything to do with it because they say it's so inaccurate, and there's so many mistakes in it. And you know, my 3 books been sold all over the world, and I've not had one email or message from anybody telling me that I've got something wrong, because everything is double checked.
No, I haven't either.
And everything's footnoted, so that you can see the paper trails. Every single email that I've received with information is listed.
Yeah, but I'm different in the sense that I see a place for, I see a place for people writing fictional novels based on the Holocaust if they're trying to introduce young children to a subject that is horrific and is not something that you can actually really teach very young children, but you can introduce them to the notion of hate and intolerance, and why do you think that and you can guide them along, and then you can introduce them to maybe something like the Diary of Peter Ginns or the Diary of Anne Frank, and books like that, but
they're not fiction.
No, they're not fiction, but if you, I can see the argument for having something that a child can actually process. Why are they treating him that way, and why are they treating? But they're not having nightmares about the events, and then the parents can guide, or the teacher can guide them to reading. Well, this is what the story is about, and you're at an age now where you can actually. You're not 7 or 8. And I know there were books I did for my PhD that were allegories, time travel novels, and allegories, and they were all very young children they were aimed at. There's no way.
Why do you have to teach very young children about the Holocaust?
I think you have to
encourage people from doing it. I don't see the point, and I don't see the point in telling them lies. I mean, the boy in the striped pajamas is just nonsense, because it wouldn't have happened.
Oh no, it wouldn't have happened.
It wouldn't have happened. So why? That's part of what I object to. They're turning it into a nice story when in fact it was nothing like that. Those 2 little boys would not have been allowed to be friends. So what's the point in suggesting that to small impressions?
I asked the author, John Boyne. I met him twice in Dublin, and I asked him why he chose, number one, why he chose Bruno as the protagonist, or the central character, and Shmuel. And he said, I could understand being outside the barrier, but I couldn't understand. I could never place myself in the victim's shoes. And he said, I never wrote the book as a Holocaust book. I wrote it as a novel of friendship, to show that despite all the hate, we all die the same. We come into the world the same. And when you're stripped of all this outer persona that says you're a Jew, I'm a Christian, when all children are stripped of that, then they become, they're more similar, if you like. There's no difference between them. And that's what he was trying to, he said he never set out to write it. And I said, it's very hard to believe that you didn't set out to write a Holocaust novel, because everything from the visuals in the book screams Holocaust.
Striped pajamas for a start. I think that's absolute nonsense. I really do. I think it pleads my argument.
It screams Holocaust to me, but he was trying to show the friendship that managed to survive despite hate.
It is complete and utter fiction, and it's creating a false scenario, which is it's just going to confuse people. I think it's incredibly dangerous. Anyhow, I'm going to tell you about my 3rd book, which is about women in the Holocaust. And this was partly influenced by my mother's experience of having me in the Holocaust and having to look after me and keeping me safe. and so on, and bringing me through, because I was only 6 months old when we were liberated. And this covers over 70 women. Most of them are Jewish, not all. Some of them were involved in the trials after the war, and that's been very well received. And there's some amazing women in there. And I could have written another big fat book, because I've just found so many women with amazing stories. But and I was a bit worried that only women would read it, but in fact, that's not been the case.
No.
So I'm really pleased about that. And as I say, I'm now trying to write a family memoir, because if I don't, there isn't really anyone else who will. And there's some quite interesting people in my father's family. I'm struggling a bit with my mother's family, and with relatives who are very unwilling to provide information. So, but there we go.
And how
I'll get there in the end.
How do you anticipate getting around that barrier?
Well, I shall get it from other people, and I shall write that my relatives were incredibly unhelpful.
and drive a wedge through the family.
I think that, I think there's a wedge already. I mean, my problem is that, because I was very young when we left Hungary, I've never spoken Hungarian. So, and also I don't speak Hebrew. So it's quite difficult, because most of the material that I want to look at is, in one or other of those languages. And also my mother's parents came from a town called Subotica. They moved to Budapest after they were married. And that was in Hungary, but it's now in Serbia. And getting information out of them is very difficult. And of course, it's been the worst possible time, with all the libraries shut and everybody working from home, and just to get information out of people. So hopefully it will become easier. Yes. I would like to get it done before I'm too decrepit to remember what my mother told me.
I don't think you're a member of Mensa. That in itself astonishes me, and puts me into complete panic speaking to anybody who's a member of Mensa. But how did COVID, the lockdown, affect you, Agnes? I mean, was it good in a sense that you had all this, I suppose, isolation time that you could spend in your lovely library, researching, or did it, did it help creatively to focus?
In some ways, it didn't have that much of an effect on me, because I live on my own.
Yeah, me too.
And I work from home anyhow. I've even as a young student, I never worked well in libraries. I got easily distracted. So I really like to have the books here, and work from them here. And I go to the Wiener Library in normal times. I go to the Wiener Library a lot. And, that has the advantage over the British Library in that you can borrow books. So I can, or they'll photocopy stuff for me and send it to me. And so from that point of view, it didn't make that much of a difference. And my day wasn't that different, except obviously I wasn't going out. I mean, I still went to the shops, much to my son's disgust. They all said, "Oh, you mustn't go to the shops, Mum," but they didn't offer to go and do the shopping
for you.
And they said, "Well, if you're going to go to the shops, you must wipe everything down that you buy before you put it in the fridge."
For God's sake.
I don't argue with them. I just
do your own thing.
Do my own thing. I did have some deliveries, but I find the deliveries very frustrating. And also, I think, when you live on your own, fruit and veg and so on, it all goes off. If you've got to buy £40 worth,
you buy a load of food and you end up looking at it and just picking it up and throwing it into the bin.
That's right. So from that point of view, it didn't make much difference, but obviously life changed. And, I've always gone to a lot of lectures at the Wiener Library and, gone to dinners and things, and that stopped. But so from, that point of view, it probably had far less impact on me than it did, say, on my sons, who were all working from home and having the children home from school. And I think, it was all quite difficult for them. But
Agnes, can I ask you, do you think it's an only child thing? Do you think that because we're only children are a little bit more adaptable, they're able to enjoy their own company and occupy themselves in a way that people who may have had a big family but weren't able to see each other during COVID because of all these restrictions, and who always need to be out and in company and flittering around and working outside, that you were equipped anyway by virtue of the fact that you were an only child to actually be able to occupy yourself at home and enjoy your own company.
Yes, I mean, I've always enjoyed my own company, and I think possibly I'm far too independent minded, perhaps even to have got married, and so I'm never bored when I'm on my own. I only get bored if I'm with people who are boring me.
I hope I'm not boring,
People, I don't know whether it's just the way you're made. I mean, my mother was very independent minded, and she was the eldest of four. So, but she, grew up in different times. So I don't know. I just think perhaps it's your makeup. I mean, I'm blessed with quite a happy disposition. So I don't allow myself to get miserable and so on. And I mean, I've certainly not found it as difficult as I know a lot of people have. And I think, I mean, I missed seeing the boys because I didn't see the boys and my grandchildren. And if I did see them, I couldn't touch any of them or give them a cuddle. In fact, the only person I cuddled for about 2 years was my oldest son's dog, who's really cute. Was always so pleased to see me. And he's
always.
I can't remember what he's called. He doesn't look like a poodle, but it's some part of the poodle family. But he's got the most amazing fur, which is incredibly soft, because some dogs have very coarse fur, and he's lovely to cuddle up against. But
you should perhaps get a dog for yourself.
Well, yeah, but the thing is, you see, I'm not a great walker, and certainly, the last few days, there's no way I'd be taking a dog out in that. I've got a green plastic dog, which actually I think he's in the lounge at the moment, and that's an ideal pet because he doesn't need feeding and he doesn't need to go out for walks.
And he's there all the time for you.
There all the time, and he doesn't bark.
And he's a sounding board. So your next book is going to be a memoir. Have you started researching it?
Oh yes, I've been researching it for about 3 years on and off, and I have bought quite a few secondhand books, and I've made a lot of contacts, and I am going to Israel. Well, I think I'm going to Israel in May. This trip has been cancelled 3 times so far. So originally it was May 20, and then it was May 21, and then it was November 21, and now it's May 22. So we shall see whether I actually get there and whether I'll get to see these difficult relatives. But I was originally going to stay for an extra week, but I'm not going to do that now because my Simon and Clara are actually having their civil wedding in England, because if they had the civil wedding in France, they'd have to be resident in Bordeaux for a few weeks, and that makes life a bit difficult with their work and everything. So I want to make sure I'm back in good time for that. So we shall see. I shall get there in the end, and there's some interesting stuff. And I don't think my publisher is very keen on it, because I tried to sell it to him when we ended up with the women's book. But I'm determined to do it this time, because if I don't do it now, I might never get round to doing it.
Agnes,
so if there's any publishers out there who are interested.
There are.
I said, if there are any publishers out there.
Yeah, I'm in the same situation. I'm in the process of writing another book, but you're there and you're saying it's the journey of finding publishers that I find just, I mean, where do you start? And it will.
I've never been able to find an agent either, because I think if you've got an agent, it's much easier. But I think because, well, I started off doing this as a middle-aged woman. I'm now an elderly woman, and I think people just aren't interested. And also, for an agent, there's not much money in it. But I'm a firm believer in things coming all right in the end. And so I'll just plow on writing the book and telling people about it. And it'll be all right. And of course, nowadays, I mean, I've not done any self-publishing. Have you?
No, I don't. I have been contacted a few times now in the last 2 weeks by a publisher in the United States, but it seems to be self-publishing, and I'm a bit wary about self-publishing.
It depends how much it's going to cost you, because
we don't have a whole lot of publishers here in Ireland, and certainly Holocaust books aren't something that, that I can imagine that we don't have a huge Jewish community in Ireland. The majority of the Jewish community in Ireland are in Dublin and Cork. There are a good lot.
Used to be quite a big community in Belfast, didn't there?
I was just going to say Belfast, but Belfast then is part of the UK currently, and so I think Belfast would probably be the closest that I'd get. But the UK is so full of publishers and agents. You should have no problem.
It's not been like that at all. And the only publishers I've had 2 publishers, and they've both been, very small and not had any budget for promotion and so on. So I've sort of done my own PR, which in a way I don't mind, because at least I know it's right. But a friend of mine who's not Jewish has just written a book on the Holocaust, and because he's younger and he's still working and he's got quite an eminent position, he got an agent straight away, and he's with Simon Schuster, published by Simon Schuster, and and his book has sold out in the first week, and they're having a reprint and so on. Now, I'm sure I've got a copy of his book. I haven't got around to reading it yet. I'm sure, it's an excellent book, but I don't think it's any better than any of mine. But I know. No, I think being an elderly woman,
I don't think that's
really
interested anything to do with it, Agnes. I think you're, if anyone knew you, they'd know you're far from elderly in your mindset. Do you know?
It's probably because I've got young, I had my children quite late in life, so I think they've kept me young, and I spend a lot of time talking to students and so on, and I've always enjoyed that. And I've got 2 honorary graduate degrees from doctorates from Sheffield University and Oxford Brookes, and the response I had from the students on the day of the graduation and so on was just amazing. So I think people are quite blinkered, really, and they're looking at the bottom line. But I think my books, could do well. And desperate to have a film made out of the other Schindlers or a TV
Yeah,
series,
yeah.
because I think it would be really fantastic. And whilst the relatives are alive, you know, they could go to the places where the rescues took place and film it there and so on. And I think people would be terribly interested. But there again, you know, every time I approach anyone, they say, well, have you got the funds? Well, I haven't got the funds. So
it's
we
terrible
shall
when
see.
it's terrible when people can't see beyond money to the to actually the historical value of something, or to the historical necessity, especially nowadays. I mean, with the rise in um, anti-Semitism, which is,
Well, yes, and it seems so short-sighted. And as I say, I think people are very blinkered in their outlook. So I just plough on regardless. I give my lectures. I did a Zoom lecture for Lincoln University Business School a couple of weeks ago, because I was meant to go up on the 25th of January for Holocaust Memorial Day. That was cancelled from last year. And then decided it really wasn't a good idea. So I did it on Zoom. In fact, did I send you that?
no.
No, I'll send it to you, because that's actually got the photos. And it was the first time I'd done one on Zoom, but it seemed to go okay. So
Yeah,
you could perhaps put the link
photographs
on
in.
here.
I will. The photographs.
And all the photographs are there. Yes.
Yeah. But what was I going to say? Do you find that Zoom has opened up the world, really, in a sense, because at least you can give a talk anywhere in the world, and not
Well, I've only done the one, you see.
library.
I've only done the one, and I mean, it went remarkably well. They seemed very pleased with it, and the feedback was very good. But from the point of view of being a lecturer, you've got no audience response.
No.
You don't know.
Yeah.
And I mean, you can tell by their faces, you know, whether they're interested or whether they've, you know, fallen asleep, or if they're chatting to their mates and so on. Or the thing which I really won't allow in my lectures, and that's that they've got their sandwiches out. But you haven't got that rapport, and of course you're not meeting people afterwards and having the questions and so on.
Yeah.
So I wouldn't like to replace
no, I
actually going to give the lectures and meeting the students or whoever, because I actually think that's important. I think it's much more memorable for the audience if you're actually there in person. And
Agnes, what was your feeling when you first had your first book, The Other Schindlers, in your hand? And it was the cover was done and everything, and it
was amazing. I didn't actually burst into tears, which I thought I would. At the time I did shed a tear.
I won't tell you what happened to me. I won't tell you what happened to me. It was a disaster.
When a box of the books arrived, and I opened the box, and there were all these copies lying there, and that was when I shed a tear, and I thought, bloody hell, it's really happened. And and I mean, you know, the thing that was I was obviously sad that my parents weren't there to see it, because in some ways, you know, I did it for them, but it's there, and I know that you know, whatever happens, my books will be sitting on the shelves of the British Library whilst the British Library exists.
Yeah, I'm surprised that you can't rent out a book from the British Library.
Well, I just think it would be impossible, and also they are a copyright library, so they're responsible for keeping a copy. Whereas, if it got lost, I think the administrative task of letting people borrow books would just be phenomenal. I mean, have you been to the British Library? No. Well, when you go to the reading rooms, I mean, there's more than one reading room, and you know, it's absolutely vast. And
Yeah,
I just, you know, and the Holocaust books are mostly replaceable. So it's easier for the Wiener Library. I mean, it's the only Holocaust, a dedicated Holocaust library in the UK, and I mean, it's a great facility. If you're in London, you should visit, because it's.
Well, my family are still all there. My only first cousins, and my aunt is in London. My uncle's in Wales. Yeah, as I said to you, I was born in North London, Wembley, which isn't too far from you.
You know, indeed.
Yeah.
Well, I hope that's been of interest.
It's been absolutely delightful, and I love your green. You wore green in honor of the Irish today.
Well, actually, this is my interview jumper, because I think I
have an interview jumper.
No, because when I go and speak, I always make a point of dressing brightly, so that, you know, people don't look at me and think, oh, she's no biddy. And I love this jumper. And actually, I bought it in Sainsbury's.
It's a beautiful shade. There's a Holocaust survivor, and I'm getting her on my show. I've been trying to get her on my show forever. And it seems impossible. And she's Dr. Edith Egger, and she's a psychiatrist, and she was a Holocaust. You should look her up. She wears the most colorful clothes that you ever. She was on the breakfast show many times in the UK, and she's just like you. She's so entirely upbeat. And she was a dancer, and she survived because she was a dancer. And she
quite a bit older than me.
Oh, she is. I mean, but she's just. I'm just seeing if I can screen share her here, and that's Dr. Edith Egger, and she wears the most beautiful turquoise.
She's another Hungarian. Where does she live?
She lives in the United States.
Oh, right.
And she's just impossible to she's on Facebook, and I've been trying to get her for ages, but seems like I'm a step closer. But like you, she is into all these bright colors and multicolored scarves, silk scarves, and you know, and I just think it puts you in a good mood when you see somebody in bright colors.
Well, that's right. You know, if you see someone in grey or black or whatever, you know, it puts a dampener on things, really. And again, particularly when I go to speak to young people, I think it's important. So as I say, this is my.
That's why the Queen always wears bright colours.
Yes.
So that
she's got some amazing outfits. I love lime green, and she had that wonderful lime green outfit when she was 90. I told my sons, if I get to 90, I'm going to have a lime green outfit with a matching hat.
You can come on the show here with your lime.
Yes, indeed.
If I'm still alive.
Yeah, we'll get the sound sorted next time.
Get the sound sorted. Well, Agnes Grunwald Spier, it's a great name.
Oh, well, it's a made-up name. You see, people ring up and they say they want to speak to Mr. Grunwald Spier. And I say to them, there is no such person in the whole world, because my maiden name was Agnes Grunwald. Yeah. And then when I was married, I was Agnes Spier. And when I divorced my husband, I still had children at school, as I told you. And they, of course, their surname is Spier. Otherwise, I would have just gone back to Agnes Grunwald. But I didn't want to lose the connection with Spier, particularly when I was going to the school and so on. So I thought I'd double-barreled it, and I'd ask the boys what they thought, and you know, they weren't bothered. And
seems like you don't get bothered much.
Particularly now I'm a writer, I think it looks really nice on the books, you know,
It looks
nice.
fabulous on the books. I think I
Yeah.
might go. I might start going by Mary O'Dwyer Honan, because my mother was O'Dwyer and my father was Honan. And so I think I might go, you know, bite the bullet. I always, you know, it looks nice on the book.
My middle son has now changed his name because he married a young lady whose surname was Edgar. And when she married, she wanted to be called Edgar Spear. So, and now they've got 2 children. So the children are Edgar Spear. So he's changed his name from Spear to Edgar Spear. So, you know, the family have all got the same surname. So I don't know what happens if someone who's got a double-barreled name marries someone who's got a double-barreled name. Could get kind of complicated.
They get confused. Yeah, you know, you could end up Spanish.
Sorry?
You could end up Spanish with all this. The Spanish name. Spanish people have about 4 names.
Oh, I don't know. Yes, I don't know. But anyhow,
Anyway,
I'm quite. There it is. So lovely to talk to you.
and it was a pleasure to talk to you. And we must keep in contact.
Yes, thank you. And when will this go out?
Just as soon as you send me the photographs, I'll be able to include them in this. And
Okay.
it should be out either tomorrow or the day after, depending on whether you, you know, how soon you can get.
I can do it as soon as we finish. I'll just send you to the link, link and Zoom.
Exactly.
Yes.
Send me a
and
link.
The technical people can sort it out.
I'll-
It's not my forte. My scanner's gone on the blink.
I do all the technical side of I do all the editing. And
Oh, really?
yes.
Yeah, so. And what sort of audience do you get?
Well, we're relatively new doing this, and we've about 20,000 viewers, which is good, you know, for a start. And I'm sharing them on Facebook and on Twitter and on LinkedIn, and we still haven't got, we're not utilizing it as much as we could. But one of the guys that's with us now, he said to us, that he's going to take over that side of it. But yeah, it's starting they're starting to gain traction. And I have one particular YouTube channel dedicated to all my Holocaust interviews. So with survivors. And
send me the link to that as well, and I'll put it on my website.
I think you know Gillian Wallens-Perry.
Yes.
I've interviewed Gillian and Eva Geringer Schloss. And Dame Helen Hyde.
Yes, I know them. Yes.
And yeah, so people they've all been on with me, and
Eva Schloss is amazing, isn't she?
She's an extraordinary woman. For anyone who's listening in now, she's the posthumous stepsister of Anne and Margot Frank, but she's an extraordinary woman.
Yes, because in 1995, I was on the committee that brought the Anne Frank exhibition to Sheffield. That's how I know Gillian Wallens. They were just starting then. That's right. And Eva Schloss came and officially opened the exhibition. And, in 1995, I thought she was amazing. So she just seems to plow on regardless.
She seems to be a woman who doesn't take tolerate fools gladly. She's a straight up sort of a woman who says exactly what she feels and doesn't pull any punches. And I like people like that.
Not like that.
You're like that, I know.
All the Holocaust fiction people will be making wax models of me and sticking pins in. I don't think there's any point in pussyfooting around, is there? But there we are. Thank you so much.
Agnes,
pleasure.
Agnes Grunwald Spier, thank you very, very much. Shindera leis an chlár. That's the end of the show for today. Until the next time, le cúnamh day. Bawalum tu galéir chiacana sonus agus gorá. I wish you peace, happiness, and love. Agus gadéishiv slán. Shalom.
Shalom. Thank you very much.
Bye, Agnes.
Bye-bye.
I do every so often at appropriate meetings for the Your College meeting is to invite guest speakers who can share experience or expertise or their insights on a particular event that is occurring in the calendar. And this week, as I'm sure everybody is aware, we have a particularly significant event in the calendar, which is Holocaust Memorial Day on this Thursday. And so I'm absolutely delighted to be joined today by Agnes Grunwald Spier, whom Agnes and I met in slightly odd circumstances, actually, but it was a wonderful experience in Oradea in Romania, and Agnes can say a little bit more about that if she wishes. But I was in Romania. I met Agnes at the airport. We shared a flight back together back to the UK. We got chatting, and we've really stayed in touch ever since. And we have an open invitation to Agnes to come and speak in the Great Minds series at the university. But of course, this year we decided that the risk was probably still too great to invite her in person to come to the university. So instead, Agnes very kindly agreed to come and speak to this meeting, to the All College meeting, and to, well, you'll see what Agnes has got to say. It's a great story. I'm not going to propose to do anything else this afternoon in the meeting. I'd like to make sure we have the meeting set aside and dedicated to Agnes's presentation to us. So I'm not going to say much more, because Agnes can, of course, you can introduce yourself, and I don't want to get in the way of your presentation. But I'd just like to say how personally honoured I am to have you joining us today, Agnes. It was relatively short notice. I'm so pleased that you're able to. And you know, in particular, I think it's a really appropriate way of marking such an important event in the calendar. So I think without further ado, colleagues, by the way, I should say also, and Agnes, I'm sure you'll be very happy with this, we'll allow you to present. Colleagues, do pop things into the chat. I think Agnes has prepared something which will last about maybe 40 minutes, 30 to 40 minutes, if I'm not mistaken, Agnes. So
we shall see.
We'll see how we get on.
Yes.
But we have an hour slot available, so there may be a little bit of time towards the end if anybody has any particular questions of anything that you've presented. So Agnes, if that's okay, I shall hand over and let you take the floor, as it were. Agnes.
Thank you very much, Craig. Well, this talk was meant to happen last year, and COVID got in the way, and it's got in the way again. But we are not defeatist, and so here we are. And I should point out the old adage about old dogs and new tricks. This is the first time I've done a Zoom presentation, particularly with a PowerPoint. So if it's successful, I shall think I'm awfully clever. Well, all good stories start with a wedding, and this was my parents in Budapest on the 23rd of March 1942. I come from a Hungarian family. At the time, you'll all be aware, the war was waging all round, but Hungary hadn't been occupied by the Germans, although it had had its own anti-Jewish legislation since the 30s. So my parents got married then, and I think they both looked quite glum. Whether they had any idea of what was going to happen, I don't know, but I will tell you their stories separately, because their stories are completely different and not within the norm of usual Holocaust stories. My mother was the eldest of 4 girls, and I put this picture in not because it really has any relevance to the story, but I just think it's really cute. And my mother was the eldest. There are about 7 years, I think, between her and the youngest. And even right at the end of her life, she was still complaining about the fact that they all had to wear the same outfits. And she really thought, as the eldest, it was a bit infra-dig. But I think those bows are really cute. And I only had sons, so I didn't have the chance to do anything like that. This is my mother with her family. My mother is on the extreme right. And as you can see, it's my grandparents' 20th wedding anniversary. Next to her is her father, Armin. And the tall girl next to him is Clara, who was quite important in my life. And then there's Ergie, who's the little one, their mother, Rosa, and Ibi, who was the third daughter, who was the last one to die. Armin, well, Rosa died in 1941 in hospital. She was quite a sickly woman, and it was nothing to do with the war or the Holocaust. Armin carried on, obviously, afterwards, but when the Germans occupied Hungary, which they did in March 1944, one day he was on a bus and the bus was stopped by the Nazis, and they came on and they said, "Are there any Jews on the bus?" And you couldn't deny you were a Jew unless you had false documents, because your papers had a great big red J. So he was taken off the bus and taken away. I'm quite cynical about the Hungarians because of what happened to my family, but the bus driver recognized him, and he must have been a really decent man, because when he finished his shift, he went round to the family and told them what he'd seen. Armin was never seen again by the family, and after the war, they found he'd been taken to Auschwitz. And I should imagine he was probably gassed on arrival, because I've not been able to find a number for him, and you only got a number if you were, if they decided that you were fit to work, and he had been quite a sickly man. Fairly recently, I discovered that he'd been with his brother, I think it was called something like Gula, when they were taken away. And in a bizarre sort of way, I found that a little bit comforting, really, because I thought, well, at least he wasn't on his own, and whatever they had to face, they probably faced together. This is the tombstone in Budapest, which was put up for their mother, as you can see, and then after the war, they added their father's name. This, as you can see, it's me with my parents in 1946. I'm not sure about the tambourine. My mother was extremely musical. I am not. And I assume that it was something that the photographer had in a pile of toys that gave the little darlings to keep them quiet. I certainly didn't pursue my career with the tambourine. So there are my mother and father in after the war, and looking at them, you would have absolutely no idea of the trauma that they'd both been through to get to that day. I'll tell you about my father first. My father was taken away in 1943, and I'd like you to remember that, because, as I said, it's before Germany occupied Hungary. He was taken away as a forced labourer by the Hungarians, and the forced labourers were treated incredibly badly. Very few of them actually came back. He did come back. He was extremely embittered by his experiences and by what his fellow natives, had done to him. And after the war, when my parents were settled in this country, my mother would have liked to have had more children because she was one of four, but my father wouldn't have any more children. He said it wasn't a world to bring children into. And so I don't have any siblings, which now I really feel I'm missing out as you get older. And in fact, when I was 10 in 1955, he committed suicide. So I always think that he was a survivor, but he wasn't really, because his life after the war was not what he would have expected. And my mother said that he felt the world owed him something. So my mother was left in Budapest on her own when he was taken away. And bizarrely, he was allowed home on leave from the labour camp, which I've never really got to the bottom of. But that was apparently when I was conceived. And so she found herself in June of 1944, having to leave her flat and move into what they called the Star of David house, where they kept the women, Jewish women were put. It wasn't yet the ghetto, but I don't think there was a great deal of choice about it. And then in July 1944, I was born, and she went to a special clinic. She couldn't go to the maternity hospital because she was Jewish. And then she went back to the Star of David house. Now, my mother didn't go in for elaborate stories, so she was very vague about all this. What she told me was that sometime after I was born and before November 1944, when we went to the ghetto, she was told she had to report the next day. I don't know how much she knew of what was going on, but she was fearful enough to try and leave me with my paternal grandmother. But as my mother was breastfeeding me, my grandmother wouldn't have been able to feed me. So in the end, she went with me in her arms the next morning. And all she ever said about it was that the man in charge sent back the women with children. She never said who the man was. And at the time, I wasn't curious enough to ask. So I don't know whether he was a German. I don't know whether he was a Hungarian police or soldier. He could even have been a Jew, because the Nazis, as I'm sure you all know, were very adept at getting the Jews and the Jewish councils, which they set up to do their dirty work. Anyhow, but for him, I certainly wouldn't be sitting here talking to you now. And so she went back to where she'd been, and then in November we were sent to the ghetto, and we were liberated from the ghetto on the 18th of January 1944. The Hungarian ghetto is very unusual in that it really only existed for 3 months, when you, which is important when you compare it with somewhere like the Warsaw ghetto, which existed for several years. But it wasn't a good place to be. As you probably know, Budapest has the most awful winters. It was bitterly cold, and there wasn't any fuel, and there wasn't any food. And also the Arrow Cross, the Hungarian fascists, liked to take pot shots at the Jews in the ghetto. So it wasn't a good place to be. My mother amazingly managed to breastfeed me all through, even though she had very little to eat. And in fact, she said to me afterwards, when she went back to her flat, I was such a bonny looking child. Everybody said, oh, the ghetto couldn't have been so bad. Look at that child. So there we are. Anyhow, I'm researching a family memoir, and I'm trying to find out what exactly happened when the ghetto was liberated. But she went back to her flat, which they didn't own, was rented, but somehow, I don't know whether somebody else had been living in it in these 6 months or so that she hadn't been there. She went back, and the Russian soldiers who liberated Budapest were roaming around and causing havoc. There was rape and pillage and all the usual stuff going on. And although my mother found 3 Russian soldiers in her flat, she was very short, but she had great presence, and they wanted food, and she indicated to them she hadn't got any food. So they disappeared, and they came back with a frozen animal, which she reckons was a dog. And somehow it got hacked up, and somehow she cooked it. I mean, my mother was an excellent cook, but she didn't have the opportunity to prove it on that occasion. And then when they'd had something to eat, they all lay on the floor and went to sleep. And she could hear in the block of flats women screaming and dinner services flying through the window and all sorts. But her Russian soldiers just lay down and went to sleep. And in the morning they pushed off. So that was my little mum and the Russian soldiers. I think Anthony Beauvoir has written a book about what happened in Berlin, which tells you what went on. So in March 1945, my father came back And again, I'm trying to find out how he came back. I certainly don't think there was a row of nice shiny coaches waiting to take them home. And my mother had made up her mind that if she survived the Holocaust, she would leave Hungary because of the anti-Semitism. And she called me Agnes because although it's a popular name in Hungary, she knew it was an international name. She wanted to come to England because Clara, the second girl, had come here before the war. My father wanted to go to Palestine, to what would become Israel, but my mother won that one. And so we fled to Vienna round about the time that this photograph was taken. And we were there for a year whilst the paperwork was sorted out. Clara acted as a guarantor. You had to have someone who would guarantee that you wouldn't be a drain on the state. And we arrived in England in May 1947. Oh, I just put this in for interest. Jews weren't allowed to have radios after the Germans occupied Budapest. So you can see this is the receipt that my father received. It says Grunwald Philip, which is its name in Hungarian, and Kapla, 8 Kapla Utsa, which was where they lived. And apparently the radio was worth 200 forints, I suppose, which apparently meant it was quite a good radio. I've often wondered whether I could go back and claim my radio, but I doubt whether that would work. Yes, so galloping on through history, you know, I grew up in England. I had an excellent education, having been successful in the 11 plus, and eventually I got married, and eventually, and I mean eventually because we were married for 10 years before we had any children. I had my eldest son, and then followed, not quickly, but 3 yearly intervals by 2 others. So that's really fortunate. So this is my eldest son, looking rather soulful, but at his wedding in September 2008, just outside Manchester. We're looking fairly solemn because on the extreme right-hand side, you can just see a white document, and you can't see the rabbi except his hand, I think, and he's reading the ketubah, which is the Hebrew wedding certificate, and it outlines the duties of the husband and the wife, and it goes on a bit. And we're all looking quite solemn, trying to pretend that we understand what's being said, but we didn't. But anyhow, it was a traditional Jewish wedding, as has happened for centuries. So this is my ex-husband and my 3 sons, and obviously the one in the white dress is the bride, a bit of a giveaway, and me. And I always say that I had my hat specially made for the wedding, and I've never worn it since, and so it's nice for it to get an airing. But there is actually a more serious reason for showing you this photograph, because if you remember the man who sent back my mother because she had a child, but for him, there might have been a wedding in north of Manchester on that date, but the only people there would have been my ex and the bride. And I think it's very important for people to understand, because most people know, although actually the statistics do tell us otherwise, that 6 million Jews were murdered in the Holocaust. But what they don't think about is the generations that would have come from those people who were murdered. So this is me with my second granddaughter, Ava. And I particularly took this photograph when she was 6 months old, because I was 6 months old when we were liberated from the ghetto. And particularly when I talk to schools, it shows them how vulnerable a 6 month old baby is and how amazing it was that my mother was able to feed me and keep me warm and safe all through that really difficult time. So this is the family in 2019 when I celebrated my 75th birthday. Since then, we've had an addition. Yes, so this was taken in December at Hanukkah, and you can see the very welcome addition is Monty sitting on my eldest son's knee. He wouldn't pose unless Daniel held him. Daniel was looking spectacularly seedy, having celebrated his 43rd birthday the day before. But they're eating chocolate coins, and it's traditional to give children chocolate coins at Hanukkah, as though they don't have enough chocolate all the time anyhow, but there we go. Fortunately, I survived when 1.5 million Jewish children did not survive the Holocaust. And I've been blessed to have had a family and 4 grandchildren. And my youngest son got engaged over Christmas. So hopefully there will be more to come. So all I ever knew about the Holocaust was what my mother told me. And that is really what I've told you now. But when my sons were teenagers, I was very conscious of the fact that I didn't really know much. And I was living in Sheffield at the time. And as I was pondering this problem, somebody told me that they were doing a master's in Holocaust studies at Sheffield University. And so I signed up and did that in my mid-50s. Which was great. I mean, I thoroughly enjoyed it and I learned so much. And in effect, it changed my life because as a result, I had to write a dissertation to get my degree. And I wrote about a man who was a Holocaust rescuer. And that led me to have an interest in Holocaust rescuers. And the book, The Other Schindlers, was the result of the research I did. I researched 30 different Holocaust rescuers in 10 different countries. And that book was published in 2010 when I was 65. And my life has not been the same since. I knew I liked research because I'd done local history research when I lived in a Worcestershire village. But I also discovered that I actually enjoyed writing. And people seem to think, that I write quite well and that my books are readable, even though the topic is a difficult topic. I'm just going to tell you 2 or 3 stories. The Holocaust Memorial Day Trust, which runs Holocaust Memorial Day, has a different theme each year. And the theme this year is One Day. Well, I've already told you about the day that my mother had to report and was sent back, and which in effect saved her life and mine. And the day my father came back from the labour camp, and various other significant days in my life. This woman, Lenny Jacobs Melkman, was a Dutch lady, and she was training to be a doctor, but she had to stop when the Jews were prevented from continuing to, to go to the university. And her story is quite remarkable. It was sent to me by Dan Mitchman, who's the head historian at Yad Vashem in Jerusalem. And she was actually his aunt, although she died before he was born. And she was a highly intelligent woman. And I'll just have to look my notes because it's a long time since I've told her story. In October 1942, she wrote a letter to a non-Jewish colleague. At that time, she had 2 small children, and she was pregnant with the third. It's a very poignant picture. You can see her with the two children she had, and she was pregnant with the third. And she was trying to explain her predicament to this non-Jewish colleague, because she had the intelligence and the foresight to really understand that what the Germans wanted to do was destroy the Jews once and for all. And many people thought if they kept their heads down, it would pass and everything would be okay. But she was trying to decide what to do with her children, and whether she should put them into hiding altogether, whether she should go with them. In the end, what she actually did was she hid all her, she left all her children, because the third one had been born by then, with different people, and all three children did survive. But her husband, who was involved in the medical services in Amsterdam, he was taken away, and he was killed in Mauthausen on the 26th of February 1945. And Leni was arrested on the 26th of February 1945, when the baby she had was 1, and she was sent to Auschwitz, and she was killed there on the 28th of January 1944, aged 33. The man who received her letter kept it in his study, and after he died, his son found it, and his son was determined to try and find the family. And he did, and he was able to hand the letter back to her children, who were obviously absolutely delighted, because all they had was a few photographs. And Dan Mitchman, as I say, what he wrote to me about his aunt was, he considered her exemplary in the intimation of her poignant motherly feelings. More, he indicates that Leni was already then, and much earlier than the general public, painfully aware that the purpose of the Germans was the total eradication of all Jews. The next thing I'm going to talk about is the Babi Yar massacre, which took place in Kiev. It's not one day, it's over 2 days, but I've included it because it's regarded as the deadliest single operation of the Holocaust, and 33,000 Jews were killed over 2 days. You can read the testimony of Dina, who described what happened. And it's difficult to imagine how awful it must have been for the people who had been rounded up and had to take their clothes off. And also, I always think, well, particularly for the Orthodox Jews who have, dressed very modestly, and, at that time, to have to undress in public and so on, it must have been horrific. I mean, nowadays people are more used to going around in scantily clad clothes, but at that time it wasn't. And of course there were elderly women and so on. And she talks about hearing the cries of the panic-stricken children calling out, "Mother, mother." Now this is a little girl. She was born in 1934 in Kiev. She was 5 when this photograph was taken, and she was one of the people that was murdered at Babi Yar in September 1941. And again, you need to bear in mind that the Nazis murdered 1.5 million children simply because they'd been born to Jewish families. And this was another witness, and I will read this because I think it's terribly important. "I watched what happened when the Jews, men, women, and children arrived. The Ukrainians led them past a number of different places where one after another they had to remove their luggage, then their coats, shoes and overgarments, and also underwear. Once undressed, the Jews were led into the ravine, which was about 150 meters long and 30 meters wide and a good 15 meters deep. When they reached the bottom of the ravine, they were seized by the members of the Schutzpolizei and made to lie down on top of Jews who had already been shot. This all happened very quickly. The corpses were literally in layers. I mean, I just think that is so horrendous. And this article that I've been quoting from is on the Holocaust Memorial Day website for this HMD. So if you want to read more about it, it's there. People say, could the Holocaust happen here? I'm going to go through this quite quickly. We have the example of the Channel Islands, where people behaved much the same way as they did in the rest of occupied Europe, and they collaborated, and Jews were betrayed and Jews were sent back to Europe to be murdered. The situation with COVID has shown up again, the anti-Semitism today, where Jews have been blamed for COVID and for spreading it, and also in some of the marches in London in recent years, Jews have been blamed for the Grenfell fire as well. I do find this quite remarkable because if we go back 700 years, the Jews were blamed for the Black Death and for poisoning the wells, and we don't seem to have made a lot of progress in 700 years, which is disappointing to say the least. I just included this figure on the first day of the Somme because it is apparently the bloodiest day in British history, and apparently on that day over 19,000 British soldiers were killed and 57,000 plus were wounded. So you can compare that with the 33,000 Jews that were murdered in Kiev in September 1941. And I think it just demonstrates how determined the Nazis were to try and destroy Judaism. And the Babi Yar massacre is also important because so many people think the Holocaust happened at Auschwitz, but in fact, an enormous number of the 6 million were killed by being shot into trenches, as I've described to you. Rather, it's horrible, but I just think people need to know, particularly when people are walking around wearing yellow stars, because they're saying that what's happened with COVID is as bad as the Holocaust. As you're in Lincoln, I just thought I'd mention little Hugh, who was born in 1246 and was killed in 1255, ostensibly by the Jews of Lincoln. And he was buried in the cathedral, and apparently, looking at the pictures, you can still see the remains of the shrine. Little Hugh is one of the blood libel stories that occurred quite a bit in medieval times, but it still exists today. And they alleged that the Jews killed little Christian children because they needed the Christian blood for matzahs, for Passover, and various other ritual aspects. This is quite interesting because it displays complete lack of knowledge about Jews, because in fact, the reason why Jews eat kosher meat is because they don't eat blood, and kosher meat is salted and drained. So to get rid of the blood, So the whole thing is an absolute nonsense. But particularly with little Hugh, I found this bit about him in something called Find a Grave. So if you look up little Hugh, and apparently the Canon de Lexington of Lincoln Cathedral spread the rumor that Jews habitually ritually murdered Christian children, and he was there, and little Hugh was therefore given a burial in the cathedral. And the Jews were very badly treated. 93 were arrested, and Canon de Lexington forced a so-called confession under torture, and 18 Jews were executed, and there were fines, and it's quite a famous story. Apparently Chaucer even mentions it in the Prioress's Tale. So if you knew about Lincoln, well done. If you knew about little Hugh, well done, you should get a prize. And if you didn't, well, you've learned something else today.
Agnes, thank you so much for sharing with us your own life story and actually bringing in, which I haven't heard you talk about before, actually bringing in some of the other stories from the Holocaust. Now, I mean, personally, I can't think of a better way, a more fitting way of fulfilling the original purpose of Holocaust Memorial Day, which is for us to come together and to ensure that we're remembering the terrible events of history. Of course, not just the Nazi Holocaust, but more recent Holocausts, as you've very clearly reminded us that these things can still be very close to home. So it's obviously a terrible story in many ways, but also what I was really struck by was the story of hope that you brought, and that your books also have highlighted about those who risked their lives to ensure the survival of many of those in the Holocaust, and your own one day, the day that your mother was sent away again with you in her arms, which has led to you being able to create new generations, which I think is more a story of hope as well, and that's also particularly striking. So thank you so much for sharing your story with us.
Well, that's it. As I was preparing the stuff on Babi Yar, of course, that was Kiev, and you know, Kiev is very much in the news, and it's an area which has had a miserable history, really. And it's very worrying. There always seem to be people that want to rock the boat. I mean, most people just want to have a normal life, you know, have a job, have enough money, bring up their family, have a bit of a holiday, you know, go to the pub or whatever. But there are always troublemakers stirring it up and spoiling life.
Yeah, indeed, and I was particularly struck about the terrible events at Babi Yar. I mean, indeed, the Central Europe is really bloodstained, isn't it? And the suffered terrible events in the Holocaust, and in fact, I remember reading a book on it called Bloodlands, actually, which was a definition of that particular area of Central Europe. They suffered dreadfully in the eastern parts of it under Stalin, and then of course through the period of the Holocaust. It is, you've described the events of Babi Yar. It's almost impossible for us to imagine. It really is. But what we can do is make sure that we don't forget.
Yes, I didn't have time because, as you said, you know, didn't have a lot of notice. Somewhere in my system, I have got a photograph of a man with a cart selling clothes, and the clothes that the people had to take off to be shot, they were being traded almost whilst they were still warm. People were making money out of those clothes. And again, I just find it so, it's just so disgusting. And I mean, the thing that's difficult to say, but has to be said really, is that particularly in Central and Eastern Europe, I've already referred to Hungary, but Lithuania, Latvia, and so on, and Poland, there were people that helped Jews and rescued Jews, but there were also many people who were only too happy to get stuck in and join in the attacks on the Jews, and that's something which, to some extent, still exists. I remember reading only recently about an elderly couple who'd helped their neighbours during the Holocaust, and they were belatedly being given an award, and they didn't want to have it because they didn't want their neighbours to know that they'd helped Jews in the war. And you just begin to despair, really. How can we ever improve the situation? It's I do find it difficult. I look at my little grandchildren and I think, what sort of world are they going to be growing up in?
Indeed, Agnes, and you've alluded to the very deserved awards that you've received at universities. I think one of the things that I'm sure my colleagues will be happy for me to refer to it, but I think one of the things that really strikes me is that at university, this is kind of what we do, right? I mean, we have a very international community here. We take pride in the fact that we have a mission to create global citizenship, responsible leaders, and the process of education and the exposure of people to the other, to people who are different than ourselves, who are perhaps not necessarily the people that we've grown up with in our own communities, and the ability to work with them, understand them, learn from their cultures, has to be part of the solution. I would have thought that we can make that contribution to avoiding anything like this ever happening again in our own way, I think. I don't know whether that's your experience of university, but certainly that would be my thought on it.
Yes, I mean, when I speak at universities, I always get an amazing response, and I particularly remember when I got my honorary degree at Sheffield University. As you all know, there's one or two honorary graduates, but the bulk of the people there are just ordinary graduates with their mum and dad come to get their degree, and they don't really want to sit there in their best bib and tucker with me banging on about the Holocaust. But at the end, when I'd finished my acceptance speech, they literally all stood up and clapped, and the chap who'd organised the event, and can't remember, the public orator or whatever he was called, he said in all the years he'd been doing it, he'd never heard such a response from the students. That there was prejudice of different sorts, and I just think that's terribly important. The whole question of the other. We all tend to want to be with people who are like us, and to like people who are like us. And unfortunately, that doesn't make for a nice, safe, cozy world.
Absolutely, Agnes, and so I think that's a really, really powerful message for us, I suppose, as educators, in a sense, which is the question how we can make sure that we're continually exposing our students to not the comfortable facts of life, but sometimes the uncomfortable facts of life, like, for example, memorializing the Holocaust Day, and have them understand actually that the sort of instinctive xenophobia or fear of the other that I suppose is part of being human, actually, in some ways, is not inconsequential. It is the start of a process of radicalization, which can lead to the horrific events that we've been talking about. And I'll remind colleagues that last year we had a great talk from Carol Glover in our chaplaincy, who was talking about her personal experience of Bosnia in 1995, so where we had very similar, not of course to the same scale, but similar conditions pertaining, and indeed is now part of the memorialization of Holocaust Memorial Day. So these things are not distant; they are close to us in society, and it behoves all of us to make sure that we're aware of and we fight against these trends that can lead to the horrific events. One
of the trends that I do find worrying is this business of in universities, the students seem to be worried about anything which might be a little bit nasty or, you know, a little bit unpleasant. Well, obviously, you know, the stuff about Babi Yar is horrible. I mean, who wants to read that? But the fact of the matter is, to have any sort of understanding, you have to sort of tackle it. And that's why I just think it's so important that people understand. And when people make trivial comparisons of, you know, having to have an injection, you know, oh, it's like the Holocaust and so on, they've got no idea, absolutely no idea. And you go to university to broaden your mind. You can't live in a nice little cozy cotton wool cocoon. You need to know what's going on now, what's gone on in the past. You know, what is it? Those that don't know the lessons of history are forced to repeat them, and so on.
Indeed, thank you.
You need to know what people are capable of.
Absolutely, and thank you. That's a very powerful reminder to all of us, actually, on this meeting, that we must pay close attention to that. Sally's asking, what message should we tell our children, or do you tell your grandchildren, about being the other and getting to know the other? I
think you need to bring them up to treat everybody with respect, whoever they are, you know, their little friends and all the rest of it. And that everybody deserves to be treated equally and decently, and build it up from that, and not to have a, you know, excuse me, prejudice against other faiths, other races, and so on, and gradually build it up. I don't think there's, you know, any need to tell young children about the Holocaust, because it'll just frighten them, and there's no need. I would love, with your permission, to continue this wonderful partnership that we've developed purely by chance. Actually, a chance meeting on that plane out of Romania. It was actually out of Hungary. Oh, it was indeed out of Hungary, wasn't it? We'd crossed the border by that time. Yes, absolutely right. And that we take the opportunity when we can to invite you in person. Because, I mean, I think your message should reach a much wider audience as well, and that would be, I think, a university session, which I know we have a rain check on. So we will continue the relationship. I'm sure colleagues may wish to follow up with you personally, and I know that you've. By all means, yes, please do. I can certainly recommend The Other Schindlers as a read. I've read it myself when you first introduced me to it a couple of years ago. So, Agnes, on behalf of all of us, thank you so much for the honour of spending a little bit of time with you to mark one day, which is Holocaust Memorial Day for this week. Well, thank you so much, Craig. Yes, I remember the time we met, because actually I recognised you from the hotel, because I'd seen you in the hotel. We'd both stayed in the same hotel, and you schlepped my laptop case around the airport for me, for which I'll always be eternally grateful. And it was just one of those wonderful things that happen. And so I've been pleased to do this. And any service I rendered to you in the airport has more than been repaid with our friendship since then. So Agnes, thank you so much for that. And I will call a halt to my colleagues. Thank you, colleagues, again for your participation. And I hope that's done what the Memorial Day should do, which is to give you a small opportunity this week to put aside and to remember. So, colleagues, thank you so much. And Agnes, thank you to you for joining us. And thank you to Stu for manning the of course, the PowerPoint. Yes, thank you very much. Indeed. Okay, thanks, it's been a great pleasure. Bye-bye, everybody. Thank you so much. Bye-bye. Take care, everybody. Thank you. Bye.